This video presents examples of learning environment models because sometimes the best way to understand the process and how you can use learning environment models is to see those through examples and the way that they're actually created and can be used in design processes. So the first will begin with outcome type models. In this example, you can see the outcomes from a training program or course are listed within a spreadsheet, if you will, and they're actually coded using Bloom's taxonomy, or the level. And this code is actually then used to create a heat map with the various color variations there to indicate the sort of progression that involves against the different types or kinds of learning objectives. So this is a great way of helping to understand the differences in the learning outcomes that you may be seeking in a learning environment that you're designing for. This is another very similar example, only instead of a heat map used to design the visual aspect, we use a spark line. And a spark line is a very simple line graph that shows low and high points, and it shows the progression if these objectives are presented in a sequence. Another example that can actually be integrated into a document such as a syllabus or a training plan is this roadmap document. And you'll notice that it has some 4 key areas. It's presented as a table, but it deals with the area of focus or the topic for a module. It has even the classroom meeting dates. It has the learning objectives and the activity description. But it's presented in more of a holistic way across these areas of focus so that the learner could use this to plan their learning, but also the educator, the designer, can see how a course is developed and organized in a very simple and concise way, and without having to get into too much detail, because sometimes details in the design and the model are very good. Other times the details can be very hurtful in terms of understanding the macro level of how a learning environment is constructed. So this is an example actually of seeing that macro level in a different way. This is an example from a blended learning toolkit. And you can see it's presented as a course blueprint, and it has a course description, it has course goals. Those goals are broken down into objectives, and then learning outcomes or learning objectives are then presented as a even more detail within that. So from this outcome type model, you can see in a very concise way how the learning environment is to be designed, specifically looking at learning outcomes. This is a little bit more advanced visualization, but it can also be very useful in terms of understanding how a learning environment is designed from an outcomes perspective. So you see on the right is a table or spreadsheet of the learning environment elements. So it has the outcomes, the objectives, and so forth. And those are then mapped up against the types of learning outcomes. So again, using Bloom's taxonomy, and then any other sort of organizational strategies that might be used to organize the course, such as to watch something or to do something, some sort of learner activities. And this could be customized for every single type of course that you're working with, but it's a way of taking that sort of organizational structure and visualizing it and applying it so that you can see relationships. And very quickly we can look at the diagram on the left and see that many of the elements that are designed into this particular course have to deal with applying concepts, so that we know that it's going to be, at least the goal is to be, a very active and application driven learning environment. So now let's look at strategies. So strategies, again, take on the higher level how we're going to design a learning environment and how those the decisions that we make are going to influence the learner. So this is another example actually related to a blended learning course, and you can see the strategies deal with how the course is divided from learning environments. Those are broken down between online and classroom, how the grades are to be assigned, and the team projects that are going to be worked on in this particular course. So this is a great example, again, of a very concise and tight strategy for how a course is going to be developed and designed. This is yet another example dealing with blended learning, and again, it's a guiding framework for making decisions about how the learning environment is to be designed. And this is called a blended education framework, and it integrates all types of self-paced online courses, term-based classroom courses, interactive video courses, and online hybrid courses together in a very kind of concise and integrated web-like way. And what we could do by using this simple graphic is to develop strategies about how we're going to develop learning environments using this framework. So here is an example of sort of a diagnostic framework that comes using that same diagram. And here we can survey a particular institution and understand the capabilities that we have against this sort of strategy. And we can see by using the check marks and the notice symbols and the X's that there are certain areas that this particular institution is well positioned to adopt a blended education framework, this strategy, and there are other areas that can be enhanced, or maybe even those elements are lacking from that particular environment. So again, using strategy models is a great way to better understand how a current environment may morph or adapt into a new environment. So let's look now at some examples of system models. Now this is an example of an e-learning instructional design visualization, or EID-Viz model. And these use visual symbols to show sequence and organization based on certain building blocks in a learning environment. And by knowing the language, you can go through and say that the first element deals with information, the second element deals with practice, and evidence of that practice, and then feedback. And then there's sort of a 90% criteria that has to be made before the learner progresses onto this new sequence. Again, nothing is shown in terms of content in this particular example, but we can see the patterns that come up and can be evolved from that. This same pattern and model is represented in text notation below it, where we can see a shorthand version of it plus the 90% mastery learning requirement to move forward in this particular sequence. This is a more enhanced version of that, which is actually using the learning environment modeling language from this particular example. And here, the top of each of these symbols is a title, and the bottom of the symbols actually denotes how it's represented within the learning environment. So if it has an overview and it's represented from an HTML file, a web-based file. In the second, there we have what is a learning environment modeling, and it's actually represented as a visual. Each of these are information-driven building blocks. It concludes actually with a practice-driven building block with a research exercise, and this is represented in the discussion area in the particular learning environment that we're developing in. So again, this is a very high-level way of visualizing the organization and sequence of the learning environments that we're creating. This is another example that deals more with the how the system is developed from a content side of things. So here we have a content map that deals with a grammar module 1. Here it deals with nouns. It breaks those nouns into different types and classifications. This is a simple sort of mind map, if you will, of the content that would go into a learning environment. Another example of a system is an activity flow formal example here, and this is breaks out actually the weeks or the time frame for a particular course, and these notation symbols are used and correspond to various activities that are written within this. So this is a high-level macro visualization of how a course would be designed over a 9-week period of time. So again, these sort of visual notations are important for understanding how a learning environment system is created. Moving now to experience types of learning environment models. This is an example actually of a wireframe. So it's actually representing the visual representation that the learning environment would have to the learner, and they could actually move around within it and see how the interface is developed. This is not a final version, obviously, but it shows that how the environment might be constructed from a representation layer standpoint. This is another example of a mobile app that is a little bit more higher fidelity in terms of how it's represented, the experience, at least part of it. Um, and actually, in the version, it could be clicked through. It's an active prototype of how this learning environment would design. The core goal of experience models is really to get as close to the experience that the learner is going to have as possible, without actually having to develop the entire program first off before you can begin evaluating and understanding how it's developed. This is an example within a learning management system. Some learning management systems have these capabilities built in. This is a course builder where you can actually build in and add content or placeholders so that you might be able to see how a learning environment could be constructed before actual content or detailed production work has to commence. And that's a good way of noting those experiences. This is a very simple sketching drawing of an interface, and drawing and sketching is a very useful tool to be able to understand how a learning environment will be experienced from the learner's standpoint. This could be done with a simple paper and pencil design, and really can be used to create vast amounts of information about how a learning environment is designed and represented from the learner's standpoint. This is another example of using just text-based information to understand the wireframing and prototypes that go into developing a course or a learning environment. And here you can say that the content is merely placeholder content, but yet someone looking at this, a design team or an educator, can make some pretty important decisions about how this learning environment is to be represented from the learners before they might begin a very formal production process. So what we did is in this video we covered the 4 different categories of learning environment models and shared specific examples of each of those types, dealing with the outcomes, the strategy, the system, and the experience type models that are used in learning environment modeling processes.